that. Stupid ass. Can you guys hear me? We want to make sure that the chat can hear us. We want to make sure we're good. So I'm going to talk for just a little bit. Welcome, everybody. We got our good Twitter. Well, I don't know if I can say good friend.
4,
but our Twitter friend, acquaintance, Mr.
2,
Owen Cyclops, coming in with a little bit of a Dyer wave there, the music. If you want to hear more of that music, you can go to Amid the Ruins 1453 channel on YouTube. They have quite a few retro synthwave classics that you can hear, as well as the entire Dyer wave album, which they put together. So props to Amid the Ruins. I'll mute that out, and then we will come in with our friend. Okay, you guys can hear me? All right. If you would, Owen, talk a little bit. Make sure everybody in the chat can hear you as well.
I'm here. Can you guys hear me? On the mic. Broadcasting live.
All right. We'll let the chat's always a little bit behind, maybe 10 seconds behind. So can you guys hear him before we start going? Make sure there's no echoes, because I'm going to get bitched at for an hour straight if there's an echo. We don't dare want no echoes. There is an echo?
If there's an echo on my end, I'm plugged into headphones, so...
No, it's always my end. Hold on, I can fix it.
Cool.
Yes, I know. I know Owen is echoing. I know. We're going to fix it. Don't worry, y'all. Don't worry. All right. You see, every time you start a stream, the settings reset, and you have to get it just right. So I know. Owen is interdimensional. Yes, we know. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
It's just echoing around the sphere of dense thoughts that surround my head constantly.
He's too deep for you, lowbrow cavemen, even though cavemen are real, as I'm going to prove. It's all fake. Everything's fake. Space is fake. Space is fake and gay. Okay, you can barely hear me. All right, we'll get this fixed. I promise. All right, let's do it this way. I'm going to turn this down, and then I'm going to get turned up. All right, y'all, I'm turned up. I'm turned up. Could you hear me now? I'm turned up. Crank the volume. I know. I'm getting turned up. We got to let it catch up. I'm going to be muting y'all when he talks. All right. Am I good? Am I good? Okay. Okay. Now, Owen, one more time, talk.
Mic check. I'm coming live on the mic.
Microphone check. Microphone checker. All right. We're good now. So, yeah, when I talk, I know I'm going to be muting when he talks and then unmuted when I talk. So we know that's how we solve it. Sounds like we're good now. Everything's good. Perfect. Sweet. Welcome. So Owen Cyclops, the illustrator, the Twitter mastermind, the evil genius. He's with us. And I know a lot of people actually have requested this. Owen will get turned up. Don't worry. They've requested this for a long time. So he's here. So Owen, thank you for coming.
Anytime, man. I'm very pleased to be here.
All right. Let's get into this. So you're an illustrator. You do trippy drawings. We have one of your trippy drawings there, which is you. Tell us about the meaning of the trippy drawings first. So when I see these, they're interesting because, and I'm not trying to critique your art. I'm just questioning. I have a question. Because it looks like LSD trippy, but there's also a lot of religious themes. So is it intentionally like LSD trippy, or is it just kind of your style?
It's a really good question, man. I wouldn't say it's intentionally like LSD trippy, no. Some people probably don't know who I am on the stream, so it's actually a perfect question to like introduce myself. Yeah, basically, so I'm an artist, and the big thing that got me into art was the visionary and mystical component of it. So for a long time, that was how I thought about doing art. That's how I think about it now. I used to be into a lot of art that I see as, manifesting religious ideas or mystical vibes, basically. So I think that's carried through into my art now. I think part of the reason, again, not to like hype myself up, like part of the reason people like my art, but I think that part of the reason why maybe it stands out a little bit to people is that it is based in like Christian imagery, but at the same time, it has this energy and feeling that is maybe uncommon for that sphere.
Yeah, definitely. So, like, I'm looking at the one that is appears to be Marian. It's and so we have kind of a castle in the sky. We have the cross. We have some angels. We have the eye looking down, presumably the eye of providence. We have Mary with the skull of an alien, which is so she's beheading the Greys.
Oh, you're looking at that one?
Yeah, I like
Nice.
that one. That's cool. And then you've got like
Nice.
the rose. You've got Noah's Ark, the flood. So it's kind of telling the story of redemption and Mary in a spiritual way, right? Cutting
Yeah,
the head
yeah,
off the alien.
yeah, I feel like actually, something that I could mention, I guess, that also kind of like depicts my vibe really well is when I was in college, a long time ago, going to art school, I did used to use psychedelics a lot. Maybe we'll talk about that, maybe we won't. And I was really into religion, using psychedelics, doing art, and I saw those as three completely separate things. And I read a book called Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. Have you read that book?
I've read a lot of Huxley's others, and I got through about 2 chapters of that, so I've not finished it.
Cool. Yeah, well, I read that book and it basically took all those three things and painted this worldview where I felt like Aldous Huxley was saying to me, you like all these things because they dovetail in the visionary experience and in seeing life in this different way. And eventually I kind of graduated out of that. I stopped using psychedelics all the time, especially in like a spiritual capacity. But that idea of using art to, think more deeply about things and to bring people into a world of thinking about things through symbolism and I feel like you can get at deeper ideas through symbolism in some ways. Yeah, so that's definitely what's driving all my art, even if it's just like some random doodle I post on Twitter. That definitely is how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I can resonate with that because that's what I did with my book. So I wrote my first book on symbolism in film, and it was just because I had been blogging for so long about the way that films used symbols, and then that eventually turned into a book. So I definitely understand where you're coming from in terms of speaking a language. Symbols are basically just another version of language, and they can be a little more nuanced or a little more in depth because symbols, in my view, they're polyvalent. So that means they can have different meanings, and that doesn't necessarily relativize symbols. It just means that they can take on a deeper sense than the precision of language sometimes necessitates. You can have more nuance, basically. So
Definitely, definitely.
what is?
Also,
Go ahead.
or I was just gonna say also, just kind of like on that note, I feel like one reason why symbols become so powerful is that language, because we use it every day to talk about random things like, going to the grocery store. So language kind of collapses out of its like sacred framework,
Mm-hmm.
but symbols, I'm sure in film it's the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Always retain that like one foot in the more powerful way of seeing things.
Mm-hmm. What is the so? Here's one with a woman with some of the zodiac symbols, and then she's looking at what looks like maybe.
Oh, you're going through the archive.
Well,
Nice.
I just looking at what came up, and then I see like the skull, a red skull, and then a horsey. What's going on here?
Nice. That's a cool one. I drew that a really long time ago. Not that I wouldn't draw that now, but I did. Um, that is basically an image where it's basically about, that was at a time where I felt like I was really integrating my view of society and perfect for the Joker meme, but I'm not going to make the joke right now. And thinking of things in this deeper way. So you can see the American flags on the outside. It's interwoven with these like heptarchic, like the symbols of the planets and things like that. When I use things like, it's kind of, we'll probably dovetail into our discussion about other topics, but in my art, when I use things like the zodiac symbols, for example, or symbols of the planets, it's almost like a Jungian archetypal thing. I wouldn't say it's all the way there, but it's really more about um, how they represent like a nexus of ideas and uh, things like that. It's not really about like I'm drawing the Saturn symbol and I'm like, oh, this is going to channel like energy from the planet Saturn. It's more like what it represents, like within that like symbolic framework. I can't hear you if you're talking
My bad.
now.
Yeah, no, I'm not here to do
Oh,
like
what?
I
Cool,
forget
cool.
when we do it this way. I always have to mute and unmute. But
Oh,
no,
you're
I'm not
good.
trying to do like a fundamentalist critique. Oh, yeah, I see all seeing eye. No, I mean, if we read the church fathers, a lot of times in the ancient and medieval world, the zodiac was actually connected to just simply doing astronomy. There wasn't a division between astronomy necessarily and astrology, so they were still seen as kind of the same. And you'll see actually a lot of the church fathers, St. John Damascus and Exposition of Orthodox Faith, he actually talks about the zodiac symbols and how that's how we, delineate what's going on in the heavens. And I'm not. That's not the point of what I'm trying to get at, because I understand that the ancient medieval world didn't see these things as disconnected. So I think it's interesting that you're playing with symbols on a lot of different levels in a very colorful, unique way. And that leads me to the next one. What is going on with Rainbow Pope here? What is that? Explain
Oh,
Rainbow Pope.
nice. Um, that image actually, so this is, if anyone doesn't like follow me on Twitter or anything, this is way more recent. This image, I have this reproduction of a medieval book of hours here at my house in my studio. If anyone doesn't know what that is, it's kind of like a medieval almanac of all different things, basically, that's very like heavily illustrated. And in there was this tiny, tiny, tiny drawing that was just like that, with an image of like God the Father in the heavens with these angels like hidden behind him. And it must have been like 1 inch by 1 inch. And I just saw it in the corner of this page. And I thought, wow, that's like dying to be made into something full and more complete. So for me, I really thought of it as an illustration of like God the Father, basically. I know that's like somewhat heretical in like certain capacities. That's why if I ever like step into a place where I'm not like 100% comfortable being like, here, look at this picture I painted of God the Father. Like, I don't really present it that way. But that's what it was to me personally, was an illustration of that. He has this like, solar disk behind him with these angels with the eye wings hidden behind him. Um, so that's mostly what I was thinking there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, there's a really good article that I read. I'll have to dig it up, but it's about the sense in which we do and don't image the person of the Father. I'm not trying to get distracted, but it's actually it's interesting because that topic just came up like 2 or 3 days ago, and the Council of Nicaea to the Seventh Council had said basically that we don't image the divinity, and there's actually letters from Pope St. Gregory II which say that we don't even picture the hypostasis, so the person of the Father, but we actually can do or image the idea of the Father. So this is actually a little nuanced Orthodox distinction, which is how at times it is appropriate to, in some capacities, have versions of images of the Father. For example, the word Father. I mean, in a way, that's an iconic representation of the Father. But we're very careful not to image the hypostasis, the person of the Father, because as many councils and fathers laid down, the Son is really the only valid icon of the hypostasis of the Father. So I'm not knocking your drawing. In fact, I'm saying that I don't think it's necessarily wrong, because it's conveying the idea of the Father, and I get the impression that's kind of what you were going for. I'm not playing gotcha with like heresy or whatever, but it's just funny that you said that, because that had just come up on a Facebook discussion that we had the other day. All right,
Oh, nice.
I got one more here. So this one stuck out.
Actually, wait.
Yeah.
I don't know if you just changed it or not, but I will just say one other thing, since we like touched on the psychedelic thing and that one. You asked about like the rainbow aspect. I feel like also, just casually saying this, a big part of my work, I feel like, is not conceding a lot of territory to these like big fields of ideas that have kind of colonized all these different visual aesthetics. Like, for example, like people see like, rainbows and brightly colored things and really intricate patterns sometimes. And they're like, oh, it's like, it's like acid, it's like LSD or something, right? And I kind of want to take a little bit of that territory back. I want to, I'm like, no, it's not just acid. Like, that's part of like the visionary beauty of life. Like, it's not just about like being on mushrooms. So yeah, just throwing that out there. That's part of why I also feel like there's a psychedelic
Yeah.
edge maybe in the work sometimes. Yeah.
So do you smoke Joe Rogan?
I don't smoke weed or DMT, but I'm not sure which one
No,
you
but do
mean
you
by
smoke
that.
Joe Rogan?
I would if I had access to
Okay.
some here. I can't find any though.
All right. Well, that's just a dumb joke we've been making on my podcast for a while.
Nice. I made a
So
comic about Joe Rogan getting lost in DMT world. If you didn't see it, I'll send it to you.
that's funny. Sweet. See, you should be listening to my stuff because we make the same jokes, dog.
Perfect.
Um, in the chat, by the way, I did put that article that I came across. So there is the article on the different senses to which we can speak of and image the Father and which we don't. Just putting that in there because it was a big discussion we had the other day. Anyway, so back to this. All right. This next image, we're not going to just like decode your images all day, but we do a lot of decoding here, so it does make sense. This one is looks like red fiery monks, and there's like a fiery monk coming out of a monk, like a
Oh,
Russian.
whoa, you're hand selecting. Nice. Nice.
Got the pyramid. So help us. So we got a rooster, we got a pyramid, we got some turrets, demons. What's going on here? This is fascinating, but I can't decode it. Decode it for me.
This is a good selection. This is like, normally sometimes like an artist, you only hit like the radio hits. You're going deep, these deep cuts, deep vinyl cuts. I drew this actually when I was back home, and for me, wherever I am really affects the art that I'm making. And when I go back home, I feel like the person I've become and the person I used to be are really in this intense juxtaposition where, I have my family back home and I live this totally new life now. And they're kind of at odds with each other. So basically, I just drew this as like a symbolic self-portrait. It's in a big triangle shape. An upwards pointing triangle is a symbol for fire. So it's all about like fire, but in a deeper, more symbolic capacity. So there's me in the center. There's the head growing out of the top. That's like kind of the higher self. Classic Illuminati pyramid in the background. I think this was at the time, like it ever stopped. It's still going on now, where they were pushing like the Russia, America conspiracy, Trump voting situation. So I have this, turret in the back. There's the American flag, the rose. This is really just like an arrangement of symbols that I do as a way of thinking through ideas more deeply. So it's not really like I would sit and be like, oh, here's what, this thing represents and this thing represents. It's more of like an active process by which I think through things that are like going on in my head.
So when I search you and I look through your artwork, this dude comes up. This badass mofo. Well, you know what? You can't see him. So here, let me send you this.
No, I can see. I
Okay,
have the
see that?
YouTube loaded on my phone.
I got you. Who is this?
Dude,
That's not you, I assume, right? You're not like
No.
you're not a secret male model named Rick Owens, who's Owen Cyclops, right?
No, there's this guy, and there's some fashion designer who has the last name Owens, and I think has a sock that's called Cyclops or something. And when I search for myself,
You
that
get
comes up sometimes.
this mofo. Okay. then
No,
that's what's going on.
I used to be around people that were really into the fashion world, and then I moved as far away as possible from all of them. So I am not working in the fashion industry. I think you might be still muted if you're talking, or you're just letting it sink in that I'm not a fashion mogul.
No. Well, I mean, maybe you are a secret fashion icon. Like this emaciated dude here could easily be you, I would assume, right? Does that look like you?
Wow, yeah, that's my exact physique right now.
That's what this is what male models look like now. If you ever look up how male models look, it's crazy. They look like this guy. Same.
I'm so glad I don't know that.
Yeah. This is another. He's wearing a giant bag, basically. It's like hammer pants mixed with a body bag. This is fashions. Man,
You're taking me back so hard to seeing people wearing just the weirdest stuff in New York.
Anyway, so let's get back to coherence here. So how about the esoteric and philosophy? And did I see something at one time that you were interested in, like Buddhism? What got you in that vein of things? Was it just the drug stuff, or was it you're just a naturally inquisitive guy, or did you have somebody that you talked to in art school, or how did you get into religious and deep metaphysical thoughts?
Oh, such a good question. Well, it all started, I condensed it a little bit, but not overly put it in too much of a nutshell. it really all started with the Daodejing. And what happened, I'm sure this happened to other people too. I went to college, this was a long time ago, and I honestly got really, really, really depressed. I got the most depressed I'd ever been up until that point in my life, just for a variety of reasons. I was going to art school and it really sucked, honestly, and everyone there, I really just didn't like them. And I started smoking weed a lot, which probably didn't help either. So I was super depressed. And in retrospect, I don't know why I did this, and I'm kind of surprised that I had this thought. But I was just thinking, I'm so depressed. There are all these old books around me, and there must be some reason people have kept these old books around. There must be something in there that might help me in this situation. So I really just pulled up a list of like the oldest books and started reading them. And I think one of the first ones was the Tao Te Ching. And that's what really opened me up to mysticism and theology and religion in general. Up until that time, I had never really thought about it, but I was one of these people who was like, yeah, religion, like that's just like dumb stuff, right? But reading the Tao Te Ching really made me realize that there was something to it in general, and that there was something more like subtle going on behind the scenes of reality, I guess you could say. So once that happened, I probably didn't read a book that wasn't a religious text. I mean, until now. I mean, for the next like 10, 12 years. I only read religious texts from all different cultures. My goal was to read one at least from every different culture. So I was just doing the full survey. And that was my life for a while, just, doing art, reading religious texts. That was basically it. I think I was too green, like too much of a novice to really even think like, oh, is this true or not? I really just wanted to like survey everything and see what was going on in this world that I hadn't been exposed to. So that was my life for a while. To cut to the chase on your question, I actually was working in an art store. It's kind of a cool story. So I was working in this art store, and this woman comes in and she asked me if we have any glue that is totally natural, that has no chemicals or anything like it in it. And I'm like, yeah, I guess maybe. I don't know. Maybe we do. I'm showing her some glues. And I ask her why. And she says, oh, my husband is the, should I say this? Yeah, it's fine. My husband is this like Tibetan painting master, and he makes paint, and he needs glue that has no chemicals to use in this paint. And this guy comes over. He's this Tibetan guy, kind of young, and he doesn't really speak English, and he was tasting the glue in the store. Like literally, he would just open it and just start tasting it. And he said he could taste what was in it, and none of the glues we had are what we were looking for. So I'm thinking, all right, this guy's legit. Like, who is this? I'm a painter, but nothing like that. I started talking to him, and he was this Tibetan painting master. I won't say who it is, but he's one of the people. Like,
I know who it is. His name is Sri Chismoy.
Yes. Oh no, I'm doxxed.
No, that was a character I did who was like a Tibetan lunatic. That this is a dumb improv character I did that on one of my videos. Anyway, go ahead.
Nice. Yeah, so he was this guy who was like, honestly, I'm not bragging because it's him, not me, who was just like a few degrees away from like the Dalai Lama and got charged to like, be this painting master. So I gave him my number and I was like, man, this is too legit. Like, I would love to hang out with you or something. I went to Italy for a minute to study abroad, came back, contacted him, and I guess he took kind of a liking to me. And I ended up going to his apartment, going really hard into Tibetan painting. I could go into that for a little bit, but this guy literally had dishes of gems sitting around his apartment, and he would just like crush them up and turn them into paint right there in his apartment. So it was really awesome. At the same time, I had been studying Tibetan art on my own, coincidentally. I'd been reading a lot of Buddhist stuff. And that all just compressed to the point where I was like, all right, something's going on with Buddhism. I'm here for it. I'm ready for it. And that was my home base for a long time. I don't like to say that I was Buddhist because I really was like a white guy who was just doing psychedelics and living in the worldview of Buddhism. It's not like I was, being like someone who has a guru and things like that. But yeah, man, my worldview was Buddhism for a long time. And that was my home base for at least a few years for sure.
To learn my teachings, I must first teach you to learn.
Whoa. Are you enlightened, bro?
When you can balance a tack hammer on your head, you will head off your foes with a balanced attack.
Fact check, true.
When you care what is outside, then what is inside will care for you.
Hmm. True. Sounds true.
When you doubt your powers, you give power to your doubts.
It sounds legit.
Those are all from Mystery Men. So you mentioned the Dalai Lama, and every time I hear the Dalai Lama, I think of the Sphinx in Mystery Men. Do you know what I'm talking about, the movie Mystery Men?
No, I don't know that movie. I'm not very like well versed in movies.
That's okay. It's a Ben Stiller movie where it was from the 90s. They were parodying superheroes, and there's a character who's called the Sphinx, and he's just a knockoff on the Dalai Lama, but he just says these really kind of lame statements that every statement it has like a structure where it's just the reverse. Like, if you don't master your fears, your fears will master you. Like, they're all the exact same.
I'm pretty sure that's in the Daodejing, or it's in some text where it says the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth, and it like takes that structure and talks about it. Yeah.
But so did you go down a route of like Zen Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, or how serious did that mode of thought? Because I don't know a whole lot about Buddhism. I know some things. There used to be a person who was like a big supporter of Jay's analysis, and she was friends with. She knew Uma Thurman's dad, who.
Oh yeah, dude. He goes. Robert Thurman? Yeah. Oh, dude, he's like one of the number one professors of Tibetan Buddhism. He actually used to follow me on Twitter, and then when I started talking shit about Buddhism, I noticed he unfollowed me. Just saying, Robert Thurman, if you listen to this, I know that happened. Yeah, man, honestly, it's so interesting, and I love talking about it. We could probably go on about this forever, so we can change topics whenever, but I'm very down to talk about it because I feel like I can't really say this without sounding pretentious. It's kind of rare that I think you find someone that goes a certain amount of depth into it and then is willing to back out of it and say, actually, here's why I'm skeptical of this system. Not that I even could say like, oh, this is wrong and this is right. But yeah, I was really, really into Tibetan Buddhism for a variety of reasons. The thing about Buddhism is that this is all just my opinion. I'm not going to keep saying it's my opinion, but the thing about Buddhism is that you can get so many contradictory definitions and terms for things that if I gave every caveat, we'd be here for hours with just the caveats. So in my opinion, it goes from culture to culture, and when it goes to a culture, it is this dense core of ideas that then wraps that culture around it. So it goes to Japan, it incorporates a lot of Japanese things into Buddhism. It goes to China, incorporates a lot of Chinese things. When it goes to Tibet, it takes all this, frankly, indigenous, like Central Asian shamanism and just weaves it right into this hyper dense core of Indian philosophy. So it's almost like Tibetan occult, frankly. It's almost like shamanism plus Indian philosophy.
I've seen Golden Child, so I've seen Eddie Murphy deconstruct the whole thing and take it all down.
So for me at the time, that was just literally too perfect, man. It was just like, on the one hand, I'm hanging out with, shamanic groups and doing psychedelics in that context. On the other hand, I'm reading these really big books, and Buddhism was like, I have your ticket. I got both numbers on deck. And so I was really into Tibetan Buddhism for a while. Also the artwork. Tibetan artwork is really some of the best artwork in the world. And the way it was interwoven with the ideas and the philosophy, I mean, there was no resisting it for me. Definitely not.
Now, so just on the movie tip, did you ever see Golden Child with Eddie Murphy?
No.
Okay. You should watch that. I don't know if you like 80s movies, but I grew up in the 80s, so I'm a fan of 80s movies. And when I think of Tibetan Buddhism, I always think of Golden Child because Eddie Murphy takes on it's a version of Satan who's trying to destroy the latest incarnation of the Dalai Lama. I don't know. It's an 80s thing if you like it. You may be younger than me. I don't know. I don't want to dox you, but maybe you didn't grow up in the 80s or something. So, but
I didn't grow up in the 80s, but I feel the 80s aesthetic. It calls to me.
Right.
I was born to like drive a Mazda Miata down the neon highway. I feel that deep in me. So I'll check it out.
Well, given your interest and background, you would definitely like The Golden Child.
Nice.
Yeah. In fact, I've been kind of slack on analyzing it just because I want to do it the proper justice. Now, in our DMs, we chatted a while back about Surfam Rose, Father Surfam Rose. We chatted about nihilism a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Can we move on to that? So what got you moving in the direction of thinking that this philosophy might be interesting or worth checking out? I know you said you want to read kind of a book.
You're
from
talking about
Aldous.
Christianity?
Yeah.
Yeah, shortest possible view of that was doing psychedelics, was living in, Tibetan Buddhist world, let's say. I fell out with Buddhism for a variety of reasons. Just keep it super short. I started to feel like it was really nihilistic. I started to feel like its view on suffering maybe wasn't exactly correct. I stopped thinking reincarnation was real just because I was like, I don't know, maybe not. And then the whole system kind of falls apart. Also, I will keep this short. It sounds like I won't, but I will.
No, you don't have to keep it short. Just say whatever you want.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I don't usually go into this on Twitter because I don't want like thousands of people like asking me to define all the Buddhist terms and stuff. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Basically, what I realized was it was kind of ironic or paradoxical for me to say, oh, look, Tibetan Buddhism is cool. I'm going to try and integrate into Tibetan culture. When what I just described is that Buddhism goes from place to place and adopts that culture. There's actually this Zen Buddhist monk who said if a Polish person got really into Zen, they wouldn't become more Japanese, they'd become more Polish. And I was like, yeah, why am I like trying to become like Tibetan? Like, what the hell? That's how I got into Western occult, because I was like, oh, I'm into this like Central Asian magic stuff, but there's all this Western magic stuff. That's really cool. And I should be into that because I'm like a Western person. So I got into that world for a while. And then long story short there, I was like, this is kind of sketchy. Like Aleister Crowley, demons are obviously real. This shit is like kind of evil and weird, right? And then I floated for a long time. Not a long time. I just, wasn't really sure what to think about anything. Coming to Christianity was kind of, it's really funny. It's perfect because we're both kind of into the conspiracy thing. It honestly was a little bit like waking up to like a conspiracy theory, because I'm sure you've had this experience where all these different anomalies come together and you start to think, I'm kind of stupid if I start writing off all these quote unquote coincidences, like something's obviously up here. And that's really what happened to me for Christianity. I was like, obviously like good and evil exists kind of exactly in the way it's painted in Christianity. I'm really sure that God is real and he has some, interface with the world that's kind of like what's described in Christianity. Obviously, my politics are kind of like pro Christendom. I was like, is that a coincidence? All these formerly Christian countries or currently Christian countries are like, I'm into it. Probably a few other things too that I'm forgetting right now. Oh, and also I had a really interesting personal experience that I think was kind of divine intervention. I basically was like drinking a lot and smoking a lot and not really like on the right path, and it got corrected in this way. And all those things came together and I was like, man, I'm an idiot if I just keep writing this off. Like obviously something is going on here. And that's kind of how the door got opened there. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's kind of like
no,
a
it does
complicated
make
picture,
sense.
but yeah.
You said you were floating in terms of denomination. Do you want to go there yet, or do you want to stick to like one of the nihilism or the Buddhism aspect? So one of the things that I think sets Christianity apart, and not just Christianity, but in my case, Orthodoxy, would be that the ultimate, the absolute, right? I read a bunch of perennialists, and I kind of had a phase where I went through a Neoplatonism, an interest in the esoteric and that kind of stuff, Western Hermeticism. I read a lot of the Renaissance guys, and I read, Cornelius Agrippa and all those characters.
Yeah, man.
And then what I started noticing was that one of the common denominators amongst a lot of the world religions was that the absolute, the all, or whatever terms we want to use, is always impersonal. It's always a force. And I had studied a lot of the Greeks in grad school, and I remembered from, Aristotle and from Plato and all that. They were very adamant that the absolute, or the one, or the monad, is a force, is thought thinking itself. It's always abstracted, it's always impersonalized, and it's almost like a number or a geometric, structure or an algorithm or something like that is what you could liken it to. It's never the personal God of Scripture. And I think that that's where Scripture comes into play as being so important, is that philosophy can tell us a lot of truth. It can help us be precise in our language, but it can never really get down to the nitty gritty of the fact that God, in our view, what I find so convincing about Orthodoxy is first and foremost a personal God. And that to me is the starting point for Orthodoxy, and what makes it different from any of the other world religions that might also have a lot of truths, a lot of insights, but they err at the starting point when it comes to who God is. And that's why, like Exodus 3:14, when we read Moses encountering God face to face, and he says, I am that I am, right? I am is not a statement of I am essence, I am pure being. In my essence, it's a statement that I am. I is a statement of personhood. And that, for me, always clinched the argument in terms of setting our theology off against all the other world religions, is that first and foremost, this God is a personal, covenantal, relational God.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. Unironic use of a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I think a lot of people have that Neoplatonic phase you described. It's kind of an easy jumping off point because for me, I think of Neoplatonism honestly as like Christianity's waiting room. Like you were saying, it kind of gives, for me at least, I don't want to put words in your mouth. For me, it's like Neoplatonism gives you this like fuzzy Polaroid where, like you said, like they don't use the word God that much. It's like source, kind of origin of the universe, and then eventually you're like, wait, you're just talking about God, and like the Polaroid comes into focus, and you're like, that's what you're trying to describe. You're trying to describe God. It's not this like you said, like geometric matrix of numbers or something. You're like, no, it's God. It's God, obviously. As for the personal thing, yeah, man, that was huge for me, and I wrestled with that so hard for so long. There's actually this thought experiment in a book called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I read it a really long time ago, way before I ever would have thought of considering Christianity. And there's this thought experiment in there where basically it's kind of presented this way. It's like maybe you're one of these people who think that right and wrong is a human construct. Well, if you killed everyone who thought murder was wrong and everyone on earth thought murder was right, wouldn't murder still be wrong? Therefore, it's a super physical thing that it's wrong. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's basically the essence of it. And man, that fucked my brain up. Like I thought about that all the time for like 10 to 12 years after I read it. And that was huge for me because it shut the door to so many things. Like you're describing like an impersonal God. Whenever I started to sort of check that out, the door was just locked because I had this idea of, well, if God is this impersonal, matrix of numbers, how does it have this morality? How does it care about what humans do? It just doesn't really play out.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we notice is that a society where the absolute is not viewed as personal, and this again would be most world religions, typically speaking generally here, the individual, the human, is not made in the image of God. And so if he's not made in the image of God, he's just kind of a manifestation of the absolute or of the universe or whatever, and he kind of passes back into it. He doesn't have any inherent value or dignity. And a lot of, just on a social, political, practical level, a lot of empires, ancient empires, have favored that type of worldview because it means that the masses and the plebes have no inherent value. They're just lesser beings, and then because the emperor or the pharaoh, whoever's kind of at the top of the pyramid or near the top of the pyramid, he has more being, more substance because he's closer to the thought realms, the thought form or whatever. So he's special, he's superior. I'm not denying hierarchy, by the way. I think that Orthodox Christianity obviously teaches hierarchy with the history of the Orthodox Imperium and all that. But in the pagan conceptions of this, when you have this absolutist view, man doesn't have any dignity in these views. And so he can very easily be dispensed with or destroyed or trampled upon by the pagan imperium, the beastly imperium. This is why, for example, in Daniel, we see all the way up into the apocalypse of John, St. John, we see the same picturing of these pagan imperiums like they are beasts. They're beasts that rise up out of the land because they're beastly. They require human sacrifice. They're demoniacal, right? They're demonic. And so one of the things that Christianity did that was unique was that it didn't borrow a bunch of terms from pagan philosophy. This is something that it took me a long time to figure out. Even when I was long time Thomist, long time studying Roman Catholicism, it took me a long time to figure out that what happens in the history of the church is that these terms, a lot of these meanings, monad, dyad, triad, when they're used in the church fathers, there might be some overlap, but they're actually transformed. So when the monad comes to play in the philosophy of St. Basil is actually arguing against Plotinus, and he says the one for us is the one of Exodus 3:14 when Moses encountered the one, and it's not an it's a he. That's the argument that St. Basil uses against Plotinus. This is why we can't begin our philosophy with abstract substances, abstract and personal essences, forces. It has to begin with he, God, who's a personal God, first and foremost. And then the whole philosophy gets transformed because the ultimate substance behind, the ultimate fundamental substructure of reality is a personal God, and therefore everything becomes related to the personal. And that's how man thus has dignity. And one of the great books I will recommend to you as well as to everyone is probably the greatest Orthodox theologian of the 20th century is Father Staniloy's Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, Volume 1, The Experience of God. This book is very deep, okay? So I'm going to warn you, if you're new to Orthodoxy, it's probably not the book that you want to try to tackle first. But if you've read Father Seraphim Rose on nihilism, if you've read some of that, then you probably would be ready to move into this, because he's going to basically do a presuppositional critique of all the world religions and point out how our theology is unique in all aspects, because we begin with the person of the Father in the triad, and then by extension the person of Christ in viewing the world, and in what we call an incarnational theology, and by extension the Logos and the Logi doctrine of St. Maximus, which is a much better vision in our view than the tendency in Western theology. It's not to say that all Latin Western theology is bad. It's just to say that we get a better, I would say, more coherent, comprehensive cosmic scope in this theology than elsewhere.
Yeah, I actually just picked up the book's called On the Supernatural Nature of Jesus Christ, that I'm pretty sure is by St. Maximus that you just mentioned. I'm not totally sure. Don't skewer me in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, man, I found what you just said so interesting. I guess if we're kind of transitioning over to talking about like denominations and things like that, yeah, to like finish painting the picture of me and where I'm at is I kind of feel like I left that whole forest that I just described, and now I see all these paths going out in front of me, and I honestly don't really know what the next move is. And I'm in this really interesting place. That's part of why I wanted to do this call with you. I mean, you suggested it. I thought it was cool. Is that I really like talking to people that sort of have a very strong view, because I'm floating in this place where, I'll talk to people that are Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox, and I'm kind of just floating. And I know that I've left that like dark forest, but I haven't set onto the next path yet. I guess you could say I've investigated Orthodoxy the least, honestly, probably just because of like geography, as stupid as that sounds, for a few reasons. Actually, most of your listeners are probably Orthodox. I don't just want to leave it there. Probably for a few reasons. Should we go into that? I don't know where to jump off of what you just said.
Let's do that. Cool. I mean, we're moving in that direction. That's cool. Yeah. And by the way, that was a problem I had for many years. In fact, I'd already believed Orthodoxy, but I was about 2.5 to 45 hours from an actual Orthodox church, so it was very difficult. Eventually, I got to where I could just move, and then got into being pretty regular attendee at a Russian Orthodox church. So I'm still kind of far away from it, though, but not as bad as 3 hours. So I understand. I totally understand the geographic issue. But I don't
want to just say it like that, like as though I like had this like life of studying mysticism and religion, and then I was like, well, it's 2 hours away. Like, I'm not gonna do that. Like, it really wasn't like that. There's a few reasons. I guess right now I've been reading Christian things from all different denominations just to do like kind of a survey, honestly. I guess also to give people a window of the time frame. I really became Christian at the early part of last year. And for a while, I was just so focused on having like a relationship with God myself because I was starting from like square zero that I didn't really think about the whole denomination thing. And it's really only been this year that I'm starting to like I said, see that there are these paths and I can't keep walking down like no path. Um, and I feel like I'm caught in all these gaps, man. I feel like everywhere I turn, I'm like caught in a gap. Like for example, like the classic dichotomy. I think most people that aren't educated theologically in a lot of parts of America probably don't know that much about orthodoxy. So I feel like the common, caricature, if I was going to draw like, a comic of it, exaggerating both viewpoints, is Protestantism is like, oh, you can do whatever you want, like just read the Bible. And then Catholicism is like, actually, everything the Pope does is correct. I know that both those aren't accurate. I'm just giving like the hyper exaggerated view of it. And I kind of feel caught whenever I try and take a step further on one of these paths for a variety of reasons. Like, I recognize that we need some authority guiding us, but at the same time, I guess you could say sometimes I'm reluctant to submit to certain authorities that I'm familiar with. The theology, also going deeper into that. Like sometimes on your streams, when you've explained an idea from an Orthodox perspective, I have this feeling of like, oh, that's what that is. And like, that's what that's supposed to be. And I was talking with my girlfriend, and it's like, sometimes you've heard like a garbled translation of something and it makes no sense. And then someone's like, yeah, actually, it's supposed to be like this. And then it makes sense. You're like, oh, dude, that's why it's set up that way. But yeah, I don't know. I guess we should hone in on like something there. I could talk about it for a while, but that's basically the picture
Well,
for
I
me. I'm
would
like
say
floating really hard.
I
Yeah.
understand that because I mean it. Okay, so when I was 21, I started reading. I was a hardcore Calvinist. And I started reading Catholic stuff because I was, as a Calvinist, we had a high
Oh,
view.
you started from there? I
Yeah,
didn't know that, man. That's very interesting.
yeah. I was raised Baptist, and then I got into Calvinism at about 19, 20, 21. I went to Bonson Seminary for a year. I went to Baptist Bible College for a while, and then I started reading City of God and the writings of Augustine because as Calvinists, we had such a high view of this guy, and I was like, why do we like this guy who I've heard says this Catholic stuff? So I read really, really in depth. I read all the City of God, and I read all the anti-Pelagian, anti-Donatist works, and I was like, this guy is not Calvinist. So I was kind of confronted with a dilemma when I was 23. And I met with my Calvinist elders and pastors, and I went and I met with like Catholic guys, and we were having these meetings, and I was trying to parcel all this out, and I decided I'm going to have to just buy the Church Fathers, start reading the Church Fathers. I looked into like the whole history of how the canon of Scripture came to be. So this was a multi-year project. Eventually, I got into Aquinas. So that was a large part of my 20s, and then what happened was, after about 10 years of Catholicism, I started realizing that I wanted to be a trad. I wanted to be, just whatever the church always believed. That's all I wanted to do, was just have authentic historic Christianity. And I wasn't really familiar with Orthodoxy too much, and then got into the Eastern Fathers in about 2007. And then I had a really hard, the toughest part, years and years and years of trying to delineate between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, to the point where I got burnt out. And like I said, I had in about 2010, I had my perennialism, Platonism phase. I was just like, I'm tired of arguing with myself between Orthodoxy and Catholicism. And there's all these problems. So I just kind of got burnt out, and I was like, I'm just going to read like, I don't know, Agrippa and Plato and Plotinus. And I did that for a few years. And
Yeah, you try and escape the like intellectual anguish, but you can't really like run away from it.
exactly, I was super burnt out. And then it was actually the Bible and St. Maximus. So I kind of drifted back into reading St. Maximus and reading actually through Philip Sherrard, who ended up being kind of a perennialist. But he actually got me back into reading St. Maximus, the Logos and the Logi doctrine. Bought all the writings of Maximus in English, dove into those pretty heavy. And then what really solidified it for me was not just like the problems with Vatican II and the papacy and all the issues of Vatican, where Francis is. I mean, Francis definitely helped solidify that decision over the years for me, especially the last 5 years. But I think it still ultimately came down to the starting points, the Ordo Theology, which is where we start our theology, in Orthodoxy, the Staniloy book that I just mentioned was a big game changer for me, because a lot of the questions that I had as a Calvinist about starting our philosophy, presuppositions, he actually dealt with all that. And then he integrates the importance of the uncreated energies in his theology. And that ultimately is just what sold me on Orthodoxy. Other issues eventually got to be, solved. But for me, it was those kind of fundamental starting points, because I as a Protestant, I was raised and into just assuming the Bible and presupposing that kind of stuff. And for those who are interested, I put this up on the screen just because it happened to be on my desktop, but it was a thing that somebody asked a long time ago. This draw like a little version of how the transcendental argument could be, imaged in like a little, I don't know, thing here. And I would just put that up there because it popped in my head. But if we say that God doesn't exist, then we have basically three options. One would be, and it's relevant to our discussion with Owen because of like the Buddhism and the world religion type idea. And I think it kind of works out to where we have to start with God as personal if we don't go the route of the atheism, right? So if we say God doesn't exist, then the world is either pure matter and or it's eternal and or it's an illusion. And any one of those that we pick would kind of lead in the direction of the other one. So if we say that the world is just pure material, it would lead us to monism, which is that all things are one thing. It doesn't matter whether you believe it's all idea or all matter or whatever. If everything is one thing, then ultimately you can't know anything because distinctions are illusions. If the world is eternal, then you can't know anything because change is illusory. It's a version of the same idea that, this goes back to actually to ancient Greek philosophers who said that, well, if the world is eternal, then the changes that we experience are illusory. And therefore, it's almost like a version of Platonism. The real ideal world is eternal. The world of flux is illusion or dream, right? And thus it leads to the idea of world as illusory. If the world is illusory, you can't know anything. So these, I think, are pretty fundamental level questions where atheism would lead us to those necessary positions. And therefore, it's the converse of that, the worldview that we would set over in contradistinction to that would be the one where we say our starting point is a personal, covenantal, relational God, and that just happens to be what's presented in Scripture.
Yeah. I think that seeing how like untenable the other worldviews are also kind of like close me off to it. Like if you start from a certain conclusion, like you were just saying, you kind of end up in these like places where you're like, well, that's just not how it is. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to backtrack because I know you're kind of moved past the atheism question, but it's relevant again because I would say the strongest case that I could think of off the top of my head against Roman Catholicism, without getting into like PhD, THD level stuff, would be there's a long letter that Metropolitan Seraphim of Piraeus, he wrote this letter to Francis. I'll link it for everybody.
Oh, now this happened now?
No, it was right when
recently.
it was when Frank was elected, the Pope, and he wrote this long letter. Oh, I forgot to put letter to Francis. And he kind of outlines like the basics. Here it is. The basics of, again, it's kind of a long letter, but it's worth reading. I'll put it in the chat there for everybody. These are the basics of why we wouldn't be Roman Catholic, because we would say that Roman Catholicism is kind of an innovation on the way the church functioned for the first millennium. And when you innovate, what happens is that over time you kind of get these aberrations, and the aberrations lead to bigger and bigger and bigger problems. And many of our saints, all the way back to Photius the Great, right before the schism, Mark of Ephesus at the Council of Florence, Gregor Palamas when he's debating Barlaam, many of our saints point out where these innovations would take the West, and they've really been vindicated in where the West went. And I think that's what's such a strong case for me. That's why ultimately I went with Orthodoxy, is because they were vindicated in all of their predictions of where the West would go if they went with the papal claims, right? So if we, I mean, and it's not just as simple as saying, well, but if you don't have authority, then it's chaos of Protestantism. That's a false dialectic in my view, two sides of the same coin, because you have all the same problems, and I can speak from experience of 10 years of Roman Catholicism. You have all the same problems of the Roman Catholic world is not unified on their moral claims. The Roman Catholic world is not unified on how to view Francis, which of these documents is infallible, which document has the authority of sub-infallible, universal ordinary magisterium. There's all these levels that just requires all the same kind of sophistry and gymnastics to try to work through, and to say, well, we just let the Pope decide it. It just moves the problem back a step. That within Protestantism, right, where you have the problem of, well, every individual is his own authority, that can't be resolved by just saying, well, there's one guy that solves it, right? Because that's ultimately an epistemological question that no system can resolve. Every individual still has to come to know the truth. You see what I'm saying?
Dude, yeah, yes. I not only see what you're saying, I probably think about it for like 30% of every day. I feel caught in that gap. I mean, you call it like a false dichotomy. I suppose it is. But I feel caught in that gap so much, man. Yeah, I mean, where I'm at right now, I go to a Catholic church because I wanted to start going to church, and that's what I started doing. I could talk about why, mostly because of like apostolic succession, I guess you could say, and a variety of other reasons. But yeah, I feel really caught in that gap. And like you said, it's like a false dichotomy, I suppose. But I feel like in one direction I look, there's this road that leads out where people are very open to interpret it how they want. And part of me feels called to that because I think, well, yeah, I mean, we're intelligent. God gave us these minds, we should be able to figure things out. But then at the same time, I could see where that would lead. And you're like, well, you need some kind of consensus here. Like you can't just you need some kind of consensus or top down informational stewarding going on. That's really how I would put it. But then on the other hand, I feel like I have to like sign this contract where it's like, once you sign this, that's it. And everything this board says you are 100% down with, that's it. And I think that's part of why I feel stuck. It has become more pressing because I really want to get baptized for a variety of reasons. Partially because I feel like a lot of the stuff I used to be involved with was maybe like a little demonic to probably kind of sketchy in terms of like, shamanism, psychedelics, not Western occult stuff, things like that. So I really want to get baptized, and I feel like I could pick up the phone and find some Baptist church down the road to do it like this weekend if I really wanted to. But is that really what I want to do? And then if I do it with some larger organization, I really do want to take that seriously, and I don't want to just do it to get it done. I feel like I'm signing like a contract with them, and yeah, I would want to take that seriously.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I mean, one of the great things about Orthodox, for example, is that the catechumenate is typically a year. So you're going through the liturgical cycle, and then you're experiencing and being taught for a year before you make that decision to do it. I think Catholic RCIA is typically a few months, maybe 6 months at the most. But the catechumenate used to be 3 years because it was viewed as kind of a really serious decision. So I think you're definitely taking the right route. I mean, again, it took me 10 years to decide on orthodoxy, so I totally feel you on that. But let me ask you this: what do you see as something problematic in terms of Orthodox Christianity? I mean, I know you said there's like a locality issue with your geographical issue, but are there other issues that come to Orthodoxy?
Well, okay. Well, I will definitely. If you ask me, what are some, philosophical or in the most broad possible sense, like informational things that I have a problem with, I wouldn't be able to have anything, honestly. It's not like I could say, oh, well, there's this thing, and I really, really disagree with that. Maybe that exists, but I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. One of the hurdles, I guess you could call it a hurdle. It's not really a hurdle. It's more just like a door that's not locked. There's a door there. Is that I'm such well, let me put it this way. I want to make sure whatever decision I make, I do it for the right reasons. And I'm such an aesthetic person. Like my life and my intellect and my, you know, religious life in general has always been so interwoven with aesthetics that I really want to make sure I'm not doing it for that reason, honestly. I really want to make sure that I'm not doing it because of the aesthetic of it and because of the visuals, honestly, because that's such a big part of who I am. And with orthodoxy, I can't really tell how much of the draw is that. Actually, that's the wrong way of saying it. I can't really tell if I would ever be able to separate this exotic flavor that it has from what it actually is. And that's not an argument against the system at all, just to be clear. That's also not why I haven't checked it out. I'm just saying if you're asking me like what's something you think about if you think about like orthodoxy and you checking that out, that's something interesting for me. I'll put it that way because I can't tell, it has this very like exotic mystical flavor to me, frankly. But is that because it actually is that way, or is it because I'm some American person who's looking over the ocean and seeing these like cool buildings and really cool art? It's so interwoven with the art. I mean, dude, I'm down, obviously. So that's like an interesting aspect of it. I wouldn't say it's like a wall to me going there, but that's something I do think about. Because for Tibetan Buddhism and that kind of thing, I think the aesthetic really sucked me in a lot. And like I said, I just want to make sure I'm doing it for the right reasons, if that makes sense.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, I remember when I first converted, there were, when I first got into Orthodoxy, I actually went through the catechumenate back in 2008, and I decided at that time not to convert because it wasn't right for me because I was still hesitant and still holding on to Roman Catholic stuff. But I remember there was a guy I met at the church that I went to back then. It was the Antiochian Orthodox Church, and I met a guy one time who's like, yeah, I remember the first time I came, I walked in here with my wife, and I was like, man, this is pretty. We should go here. And I was like, that's not the right reason to come to church, dude. I remember thinking like how idiotic that was. So I understand that. And I didn't want to be like that, dude. I didn't want to be like, oh, smells and bells. It smells pretty in here. Like I didn't want to convert because of that. But I will say this. One thing that did stick out to me, which after 10 years of Roman Catholicism, and I went through like all the different cubicles and little niches and alleyways of Roman Catholicism, all of the Latin trad, FSSP, SSPX, Sedevacantists, Novus Ordo. I went all those little routes, and I noticed the alteration and changes in liturgy were so pronounced eventually that Orthodoxy actually had a good argument when it came to preserving the proper aesthetics, because we know in the Old Testament God cared quite a bit about proper, not just aesthetics, but the holiness, right? And the order of the worship, the liturgy, should not be screwed with. And we have, since Vatican II, from the top down, from the papacy down, the screwing with the liturgy on purpose, to the extent that even the Pope himself having participated in large-scale puppet masses. So we can't just brush this off as, oh, well, it's just an abuse. It's just an abuse. It always stuck out to me as actually a strong apologetic issue that even liberal, quote-unquote, orthodoxy, the Greeks, the most liberal, even they had maintained, at least orderly, holy worship. And for those that are interested, by the way, I'm not just using this as a apologetic tipping point, but I would recommend, if you do want to understand why we do liturgy, there is this great video from Rocor, Fountain of Immortality, that actually explains the theology of the liturgy. So as Owen's pointing out, we don't want to just be in this because it's pretty and it smells good, or there's some sort of mystical appeal. I mean, the mysticism itself is not wrong, but that video actually points out the theological underpinnings of everything that's going on within the service. So it's pointless to be in the service. Even Isaiah said this in the Old Testament. Why do you come to my Sabbaths and my feast days and you don't even know the theological meaning of them? And so it's the same in our day. If you're just going through these rites and rituals, what's the point? That's what that video is actually there to describe. So I would recommend, if you've not watched that video, definitely check that out. I think I put it in the show description. And I also have, by the way, Owen's Twitter there. So people who are asking, where do we follow this guy? Where do we look at his art? How do we get in contact with him? Owen's Twitter is linked there. We had a tremendous audience. I think we had over 500 at one point.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, thank you. That's that's up to, or that's partly due to you, bro. So we hit most of the big points here. Would you come back and do another talk and we can get like deeper into deep stuff?
Oh yeah, man, definitely.
Okay. I would recommend, because we're going to answer super chats here and that could go on for a few more minutes. I don't want to keep Owen too long.
I'm just chilling, man. We can do it however you want.
Okay. Let's see. I can't read my note here. There's a couple essays I think you would really dig. There's one called Logic and the Absolute by Sherrard, where he really critiques Platonism. Not that you're like toying with Platonism, but that was a really good critique I read back when I was kind of in my perennialist thought process. There's one guy who wanted me to ask you, what do you think of Molyneux's ethics? How do you feel about answering that?
Oh, I'm down. I'll answer whatever. Nothing's off limits. Yeah, you must be talking about what's it called? UPB, universally preferable behavior,
That's probably
right?
what the person. I don't know what they meant.
Yeah, no, that's definitely what he's talking about. That's definitely what he's talking about. Well, okay, I haven't sat down and like cracked that open and gone through it really hard, but I have listened to a lot of Stefan Molyneux, honestly. For a variety of reasons. Not really going to go into it, but I listen to things when I do work in graphic design, so it's really easy for me to pound like 8 hours worth of material most days, honestly. So I've listened to a lot of him, and I do think he's pretty cool, actually. I don't know if that's unpopular or not, but I don't really care. As for the ethics thing, I don't know, man. I feel that in general, there's always some hitch if the ethics don't hinge on something that's super physical. I feel like there's always like, well, and again, like, I don't know, I don't really want to sound like I'm critiquing his system in particular. I know that's what you asked me, but things like, universally preferable behavior, like, isn't it always better? Like, don't you always want things done this way to you? I just feel like there's always some hitch if the ethics aren't rooted in something super physical. Like, people try and make the case like, oh, it's good for society, so therefore it's good. But, sometimes it would be good for society to go to the neighboring village and like burn it down. So I couldn't point out one of those hitches in his system in particular. But I feel like if you dig deep enough, if there's not some larger framework that it's hooked into that isn't just purely rooted in like the atoms and molecules around us, it kind of collapses eventually. But I couldn't really say for his system in particular.
Yeah, well, I don't have any hatred or antipathy to Stefan or whatever. I disagree with the aspects of the system, definitely. And I did a critique of Stefan a few years ago, so I'll put that video there in the description too if you want to see a more fleshed out critique of Stefan's ethic there. I think it begs the question, just it's a very easy way to presuppositionally critique that view, is that it begs the question as to how do we know what is the good or what is universally preferable, and just to say, well, that's what I prefer for me, that doesn't solve the question. I mean, it's just as relativistic. It's just as, any of these utilitarian type ethics, they're very easy to deconstruct. I've done many videos and talks deconstructing just a kind of a utilitarian ethic. So, but anyway, people can watch that video if they want a fuller criticism. So we'll move to the super chats now.
Well, one other thing before we jump into the super chats, there is something else I wanted to mention. Since we like came so far on the domination thing, I'm actually just really curious what you think about this, because this is something I also think about like all the time, and then we can jump into whatever else you want, because it's your show. I'm not like leading the show.
That's cool.
Sometimes I feel like, since I think about this denomination stuff so much, sometimes I just feel like, there is this schism or multiple schisms in the body of people that love God on earth. And like the schisms are ultimately like a bad thing. And sometimes I feel like I just don't even want to like participate in it. And I'm not one of these people that's like, oh, well, everyone's right and we should all just agree that we're all right, like whatever. But sometimes I feel like it's just not really my place to participate in those like schismatic conflicts. And I feel like that also pushes me away from making a decision. Like sometimes I see people, and it's from all sides. I'm not pointing at any side in particular. I literally see it from everywhere. Twitter is kind of like an accelerated version of reality. So it's good to like look in that like petri dish, where people, be like, oh, those guys are like so fucking stupid. Like, I hate those guys. Like, they're not even our brothers. They're like piles of shit, dude. Just like throw them in the ocean, bro. And I'm like, is that really like the vibe right now? And I don't know, I was wondering what you thought about that. I don't really have like a viewpoint or something to push there. I was just wondering because like, yeah, sometimes I wake up one day, some days, and I'm like, yeah, like there are these schisms in like the body politic of God, but like maybe it's just not my place to participate in it or address it. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a kind of a difficult question, but just simply put, I mean, I'm coming from the Orthodox perspective, so my theological response is going to be conditioned by, the theology that we believe, which is
Yeah, of
that
course.
there are schisms that happen, but our view is that, of course, the church can't ever completely, visibly, universally fail. So that doesn't mean that I don't allow there to be grace that happens to people outside of the church. There's definitely graces that come to people in Roman Catholicism or in Protestantism. I mean, if that wasn't true, I can't, like, how would I have gotten to Orthodoxy if I didn't, God didn't grant grace to lead me in that direction. So I'm not denying that there's a lot of great insights and thinkers and writers and people that have a lot of grace outside the bounds of Orthodox visible Christianity. But I definitely think that the promises of not just Matthew 16 of the gates of hell wouldn't prevail against the church, but that actually Pentecost, this is very important because I think in the West, Pentecost has kind of been undervalued, and the importance of Pentecost was lost because Christ said that the Spirit would be given to lead the church into truth, that they would know the mysteries, and that it's not just Matthew 16 in the office of the bishops, because we think that it's not just because actually in Matthew 18 Jesus says the exact same thing to all the apostles that he says to Peter in Matthew 16, which is that they all have the office of the keys and the power to remit and retain sins. And so the succession is not something that's contingent just upon one guy, just upon Peter, but upon the collegiality of all the bishops who are the successors. So therefore the presence of the Spirit is promised to the church in its fullness in the local church. So there's nothing that a local Orthodox church lacks that like Rome has in some like super essence capacity. Every local church has the fullness of Catholicity because they have the sacraments. So I would say that I'm kind of not probably the best guy to ask about that question because I'm a controversial figure who, makes a lot of the trads mad because I left traditional Roman Catholicism. So I'm probably the key figure who makes so many of those people mad. Now, I don't have any hatred towards Roman Catholicism or the Catholic guys. I feel for them. And in fact, I want them to become Orthodox because I think it's true and because I can understand where they were at. So things do get heated. They do get feisty at times, especially on Twitter for sure. But I don't have any easy answer to that question. I welcome those guys. I think that the Amazon Synod is really going to wake up a lot of those guys because they're going to see that the fruits of Vatican II, in my view, are not just Vatican II. There's actually, we can go back to the Renaissance. There's a great book that Hoffman wrote, Cult Renaissance Church of Rome, where he analyzes the influences in Roman Catholicism for ecumenism. Don't begin at Vatican II. They don't go back to the modernism of the 20th century and the 19th century. It actually goes back even beyond the Freemasons and all the papal encyclicals against the Freemasons. I read all that stuff. It actually goes back to the time of the Renaissance, ironically after the schism, where you have a lot of Hermetic influence. So you would actually find, I think, Occult Renaissance Church of Rome very insightful in this regard. I would also recommend the book Anatomizing Divinity by James Kelly, a guy I know. I've done an interview with him on his book. And he actually talks about the history of alchemy and how in the West, Hermeticism came into the Latin Church through its view of the Trinity and the way that they would then kind of make the Trinity in nature a kind of a technology. And then that actually led to kind of the Hermeticism dominating Western thought, and that led to ultimately Vatican II. I don't know, so that's a long kind of trail, but I highly recommend Anatomizing Divinity. I recommend Sherard's essay, Logic and the Absolute, and I recommend Staniloy's Experience of God. So if we can, let's move to the super chats here. We got Bob, $5.
Let's do it.
First, Michael McNeil, new member to the channel. Thank you for being gold sponsor. Thank you. Appreciate that, Michael McNeil. Remember, if you join on the YouTube channel, you can read and you can watch the subscribers content under the community tab. So sometimes that fools people. If you don't want to subscribe there, you can subscribe to Jay's Analysis to get the first half content and the second half content. Bob, $5. What do you guys think about the abstract art movement and its patronage by the elites Guggenheim's, and this is something that I focused on a lot in my work because of. There's actually a book that I cited in my second book pretty heavily by Francis Stoner Saunders called "The CIA and the Cultural Cold War," and it's about the CIA's patronage of abstract art, modernist art, pop art, all of it. So I think it's bad news. What do you think?
That's all that stuff's definitely real. People don't really know about it. I guess there's two things there for me. You can look into it. There's a really cool thing to check out. The Guggenheim was actually built to be a like quote unquote temple of the spirit. So it has a quote unquote spiritual dimension there. I would say in a bad way, obviously. Yeah, I think most of it is ranges from being frankly really bad and stupid to being outright like very nefarious and very toxic. To keep it short, I think because of the nature of art, putting up ugly and confusing things in museums and in public as art actually like psychologically traumatizes people. I think it actually is like evil, literally. One thing maybe that I think that most people don't is that there is in there a little thread of guys who were trying to make spiritual artwork in a good way. I would say someone like Rothko, for example, making paintings that were about like the experience of seeing the color, and someone like Mondrian. Actually, if you look up Mondrian, if you look up, he's the guy who makes the square paintings that are really famous. His early art is almost like symbolist religious art, and then he progresses into painting these squares and rectangles because it's about like the purity of vision and form. I don't really like the art, but I think there's a little thread that's cool and interesting there. But for the most part, yeah, no, I'm really so anti that stuff. I mean, I'm from New York, and that's like the mecca, literally, of all that stuff, and I couldn't be more against it. Going to art school and having that stuff shoved down my throat was probably a huge part of the reason that I'm here now.
My son's got to go to art school. He's
No, he
leaving
doesn't.
in 3 days, and the TV's an Esperanto. You know that's a bitch. That's They Might Be Giants. They Might Be Giants do a funny song about alienation and the son going to art school, and it's a country song. It's really goofy, but
Nice.
you made me think of that. By the way, did you know that I used your analysis and I cited you for like 45 minutes on one of my streams? I did a video game analysis because so many people said, when are you going to do analysis of symbolism in video games? And they said, talk about Owen's mega stream on Mario. Did you know I did that?
Oh yeah, someone sent that to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome, man. Yeah, I enjoyed watching you do that.
Thank you. So that's in the show description there too, by the way. So I've got everything that we talk about. I'll try to put in the show description. I've got the letter of Metropolitan Seraphim to Francis. I've got Owen's Twitter. I've got my critique of Stefan, and then my use of Owen's analysis of Mario, which is a Twitter thread that got a lot of traction. It's really good. He goes super deep. He convinced me of about 85% of his analysis. And I did a stream on it, so I cited him and all that. So you guys can check out that stream as well. Let's see. The next one up is Emil. And then Emil says, I got to put my 50s dad glasses on here. Emil says, has your guest ever encountered spirit beings or demons while he was doing psychedelics?
To some, in a very like tertiary way, not like you would imagine, like where someone's like, invoking a being like in a circle or something. I saw these little creatures once when I was on ayahuasca. That's kind of like a long, crazy story, but long story short, I did this like fasting in the woods. I was with this group that in like a historical archaeological academic sense would be called like an ayahuasca cult. It's like literally a cult based around ayahuasca. And yeah, I did a lot of fasting and sweat lodges and then took ayahuasca with them a few times. So seeing some things where it's like maybe this is purely a hallucination, maybe it's actually some kind of entity, but nothing like in the movies, I'll put it that way.
Well, I certainly have, and I've told the story many times, so I won't bore everybody with that story. But you can find the live stream that we did a couple years ago, Bad LSD Trip Tales, and then we did another one actually with Tristan and I think Aaron and Melissa from Truth Stream a few months ago about Burning Man and bad trip tales. So anyway, I won't bore everybody with that story, but thank you, ML, for that. Skullduggery, Nerd Bear, the Reprehensible, $2. Dyer, you're crushing it. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Cloudstar, $10. I like Owen. I understand exactly what he's talking about with being reserved about going in one direction hardcore. You can always learn something from others' beliefs that can lead to doing other things. Yeah, I agree. It took me 10 years to become Orthodox. So yeah. What do you think, Owen?
Yeah, I resonate with myself also. No, yeah,
Owen
definitely.
resonates with Owen.
Well, part of the reason, actually, part of the reason why I thought it would be a good idea to come on and talk, aside from the fact that, I thought it would be cool to talk to you and hang out, is that I get DMs all the time. I mean, I'm talking probably it averages like once every 3 days of people that will tell me, yeah, I feel the same way and like I don't really know what to do, or people that are coming around to Christianity and things like that. People hit me up all the time that are in like a similar place and they ask me what to do and I'm like, look, I can only tell you to leave the forest. I can't tell you like what village to check out, basically.
Joshua Bryant, $10. Here we go. Why can't an absolutely simple deity interact with the world? Thank you for your apologetic work. Simplest response would be is that the doctrine of absolute simplicity, I would say, has two chief problems. The first problem is outlined in the essay of Father Florovsky when he analyzes Athanasius's apologetic against the Arians. So I'll add that here to the description here in a moment. But everybody should, everybody interested in the ADS, absolute divine simplicity question, the first place I would say is read that essay, because what Father Florovsky does is that he argues very forcefully and proves that Athanasius is making the essence energy distinction argument against the Arians. So the first reason is that it would negate the possibility of creation being a free action. And that's because all of God's actions are identified with his essence. If all of God's actions are identified with his essence, then they're synonymous with necessity, eternality, etc. They're not free actions. And by extension, the Arians use that same argument to say that the Son is therefore a creature, because if he's distinct from the Father, who's identified with the essence of God, if there's a real distinction, then there has to be some lesser status to the distinct person of the Son. So the Son has to either be a creation or he's identical to the essence of God, and there's no real distinctions in the persons, right? So that's in the Florovsky essay. He proves that Athanasius teaches the essence energy distinction. This is devastating to anybody who would believe in Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy or whatever, who believes that Athanasius is a church father, because Athanasius is making the essence energy distinction. And that's the first and foremost reason why an absolutely simple essence can't relate to the world. And then by extension, read Dr. David Bradshaw's book, Aristotle, East and West, who fleshes out many more arguments as to why an absolutely simple God can't interact with the world. So thank you for that question, Joshua Bryant. Alex Bear, $5. What's the Orthodox position on infant baptism? We believe in infant baptism, and they're dunked. And they're dunked because baptism is dunking, not dripping little bits of water. And it differs from Protestantism and Catholicism because, well, just in the form of baptism, we don't think sprinkling is actually what baptism is. It's actually dunking. Infant baptism is done because we see baptism as a successor to circumcision in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, God instituted circumcision because infants were part of the covenant people. And so by extension, Jesus, we don't think, would restrict children from the covenant. In fact, Jesus says, do not withhold the children, don't let the children come unto me, right? And by extension, then Orthodoxy, in perfect continuity with the first millennium of the church, even allows infants to partake of communion. We practice paedocommunion. The Roman Catholic Church, because of one of its innovations, decided around the 800s, 900s, during the Carolingian period, to forbid paedocommunion. So one of the many innovations of the Roman Catholic Church. M.L. Surik, $20. It's often said that the enemy fell for the trap with the crucifixion. Yes, this is the baiting view that John Damascus mentions. That he didn't know that Christ was the Son of God. Correct. How does this reconcile with Matthew 18, where the demons knew that he was the Son of God? That's a good question. Email, I would respond by saying that the demons knew that this person was divine, But that doesn't mean that they knew what God was going to do. So they didn't know that the whole plan was for the Son of God to die in his human nature, right? The Son of God is impassible. He's a divine person. He doesn't die. The divine nature doesn't die. But in his humanity, he really does undergo death, right? So the human nature dies. The soul, the deified soul of Christ, John Damascus says, descends into Hades. That is the harrowing of hell. And then we have the resurrection and ascension. So the demons didn't know that. They didn't know what God was doing in this master stroke here. But they could have known at times that he was the Son of God. So that's a great question. Thank you for that super chat email. Up the Trend, new member. Thank you for joining Up the Trend. Much appreciated. I think you'll enjoy the content. I post new content for members and subscribers each day. Doorman 360, $2. What is y'all's opinion on them art hoes? Well, I made a bunch of videos talking about art hoes.
Oh my
Let's
God.
ask our bro Owen. What do you think about art hoes?
Dude, I have literally lived the Jane Goodall life of studying them up and close in person for so long. It's so cursed, man. What a cursed land. Is there a more cursed manifestation of anything? I went to art school. I lived in Brooklyn. I hung out with girls that made paintings that looked like, assemblages of things that looked like literal garbage. I did it all,
Yes,
man. I can tell
exactly.
you some crazy stories. I knew this girl. Oh, fuck, I don't want to like reveal too much. Okay, I'll change the details. Dude, I knew this girl that literally for multiple years, her whole thing was just making these paintings of lamps. And you think like, oh, maybe the lighting was cool. Nah, man, definitely not. Like just literally spending her life, like years at a time and probably thousands of dollars just painting lamps. Lots of weird, twisted girls working out their like obvious psychological trauma in really disturbing art, like making these like trash altars. So yeah, don't investigate that world. I've done it. I could go on about that. Read about Lilith if you want to know about it. That's really it, right?
Like Lilith the demon? What do you mean?
Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of
Yeah.
joking, but not really. Yeah. Do you know? Have you checked that out? Like Lilith, you know about that?
I mean, I know about the history of the demon and the story of Lilith in terms of like the Kabbalah and all that. Yeah.
Basically, there's for anyone that doesn't know, there's this story basically that, long story short, the first woman wasn't Eve. The first woman was this woman named Lilith. That's like the first creation. I don't think this is true, but I'm just saying the first creation story where man and woman were made at the same time. That was a different wife named Lilith, and she got kicked out of the Garden of Eden because she wouldn't submit to Adam. And this is like a Jewish story, just saying.
Yeah.
And then she started dating the angel of death named Samael and sewed hundreds of like demon babies. And then because she can't have human babies, she like kidnaps human babies and kills them. So you have like a rebellious female figure who loves killing human babies. You're asking me about art school girls. Maybe you're making a connection here. I guess that's all I'm saying.
No, I think that that's totally. I mean, I almost went to art school when I was 18. I went and visited Memphis College of Art because I was like, oh, I'm going to go here. I'm going to be a cool art guy, whatever. Because all through high school I'd taken a bunch of art classes, drawing classes. That's all I did in high school was draw. But actually, I did an essay about 10 years ago on Lilith because Lilith actually is in Scripture. Lilith is mentioned in the book of Isaiah. So
Oh shit, you're right.
I will add that essay to the description here if anybody wants to read my Lilith essay. Because actually I think that Lilith, it's not vindicating all the Kabbalah nonsense, but I do a pretty in-depth analysis of Lilith there if anybody wants to read that. All right. So thank you for that, though. Keep away from them art hoes. Watch out. Art hoes will, we have to be careful what we say on YouTube. They will abrot. If you get an art hoe pregnant, she will abrot y'all's creation. So beware of that. Owen, awesome. Dude, this is great. Will you please come back?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I had a really good time hanging out and talking with you, man. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about, probably.
We do. We definitely do. I've got your Twitter there. Everybody follow Owen on Twitter. Thank you guys for the show tonight. I think we're going to have Boiler Room right after this if they haven't started without me. But I did tell everybody we would do Boiler Room, so I have to be fair to the Boiler Room crew as well. So come back in the next 10, 15 minutes if you guys are interested in listening to tonight's Boiler Room. Me, Hesher Spore, and Tristan from Primal Edge Health will be on. Owen, once again, thank you. God bless, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. Very cool. Talk to you soon.